So we move on to the options section, and we've identified Jane's main obstacle is that she is telling herself she has to have the perfect answer every time somebody asks her a question. So I decided to try a simple options question of finding the easiest way around the obstacle. So I modified this question here and at the same time pointed out the impossibility of the position she was putting herself into, of having to have the right answer every time. Jane came back with accepting that she would not be able to have the perfect answer every time, and that led me into a bit of curiosity about what would be the effect on her if she did accept that. So I just free-formed a question around that topic. Jane then acknowledges that it would reduce the negative thoughts if she didn't put that extremely high expectation on herself. And I started having a look at this section here about other people's solutions. What this section offers is an opportunity to ask the client to reflect about role models they might have in their head but have not consciously thought about using, or information that they might know but hadn't thought how they could consciously use. And my thinking was that if Jane could find an example from somebody she knew and respected who was able to deal with not knowing the answer to a question, maybe she could model that response and use it in her own process. And she came back with the information that there are people she knew and respected who were able to deal with this situation. And specifically, she identified her dad and one of her aunts. So again, we seem to be working quite well together, so I sort of pressed Jane a bit to identify what their response was when they didn't know the answer to a particular problem or issue. And their response of just saying, "I don't know," was of course accurate, but then I was curious about how Jane could use that information or that model in her own work. So I asked her to consider the fact of her father or her aunt saying that she doesn't know an answer, whether people thought less of them for that. And Jane came back quite categorically saying they didn't. And she specifically didn't. So sort of indirectly what I was pointing out to Jane was there were situations when people she respected didn't know the answer and she and other people were okay with that. So the obvious further question is, why is it okay for them and not for you? And I didn't in fact have to answer that question because it becomes very obvious where the line of questioning is going. So Jane sort of preempts it by coming back to state there are certain situations where she should know the answer. Now at this point it would have been very easy to sort of get stuck in a debate about how Jane could differentiate between the situations where she should know the answer and the ones where she was okay to not know the answer. But rather than get into that debate, I decided to go for this question of asking her what tactics she could use in a situation where she didn't know the immediate answer to something. And I just want to draw your attention here to Jane's use of the word should. When a client uses the word should, it indicates that they're putting an expectation on themselves or another person to somehow behave or think differently from the way they are actually behaving or thinking. So sometimes it's very appropriate to investigate the use of the word should, but in this case I tried to just sidestep it. And Jane comes back with a perfectly sensible response that she's created for herself and is therefore more likely to be able to own. So I acknowledge her honesty and then ask her how she would feel if she took that course of action. And Jane acknowledges that prefacing her answer with the truth would probably help. So she's created a way out for herself from the dilemma that she'd also imposed on herself. So I then thought I'd better check whether this would in fact be enough or whether she'd need other tactics to deal with the situation. And Jane tells me that in that situation she thought that tactic would be enough. So I then have a go at summarizing the options stage, which in this case is pretty straightforward. And as you can see, gets posted into the options tab as before. Now, you may remember at an earlier point in the dialogue, we discussed defeating negative thought patterns in the options section. And I had remembered about this, but I thought the tactic that Jane had now developed was probably enough to move forward. And this is another point about coaching generally. The session doesn't have to be perfect and exactly follow the GROW formula or what the client has addressed. It just has to be good enough to feel that at the end of the session, the client has a way forward which they consider is going to actually help them get their overall goal. So we're now ready to move on to the action stage. And as you can see, I go pretty much immediately to this section on support, because the way Jane has phrased her option is pretty much close to an action step anyway. So I started thinking that we needed to ensure that she had some mechanism in place to actually remind her to do it, or it would just very quickly become an idea that she should do but doesn't. And then I clarify the different kinds of support that she might create for herself. Jane suggests a written reminder, which in my own mind I was thinking, well, that would probably work, but not all the time. But I decided to make sure that we got that down on paper anyway. And Jane tells me that she would create the reminder on her phone. So what was going through my head at this moment was, well, that sounds good, but how's it going to help Jane if someone comes and suddenly asks her a question? So instead of trying to work it out myself, I put it back to Jane to see what she would say. And she acknowledged that that solution was impractical for that particular type of situation, and suggests that it might become a habit if she had a regular reminder. Now, I was a bit skeptical about this from my own experience of how difficult it is to change an ingrained habit or way of responding to situations. So I went back to Jane and asked for another way of helping her remember, and I actually made a suggestion here, which is perfectly acceptable in my way of coaching. Some coaches say you should never make suggestions, but it seemed entirely appropriate here to perhaps use my knowledge of what's worked for me and my other clients to support Jane in bedding in her new pattern. And Jane replies with the suggestion that she could find something to remind her that this should be her way of responding every time she looks at it. So I ask her to put a timescale on this. Perhaps in reflection, I should have also asked her, what the object was, but it felt like she had something in mind. Before we finished, I wanted to ask this reflective question to Jane about what she might have learned about herself and her approach to work that could be useful to her. The reason I often ask this type of question is it's very useful to embed the learning that the client might have done during the coaching session. So they leave the session not only with some practical to-dos, but also some learning about themselves. Jane replies with almost exactly what I might wish she got from the session, but I would think it's too early to say that she sort of ingrained this way of thinking into a new way of being, but hopefully it's a useful start for her. So I acknowledge it and summarize the section. And here again I use the drag and drop feature to pull the to-dos to the input panel and put a date by them. Then I acknowledge Jane for taking part in the session, and she tells me that it's been useful. And as you can see, my final comment was that I would be following up with Jane to see how her new intentions went, because as we've already pointed out, it's very unusual for an ingrained habit to change that easily. So I would think it would be really important to actually follow up and find out if the reminders that she set herself have actually worked or not. So that's the conclusion of the coaching session I did with Jane, and further sessions will be posted up shortly. Thanks for watching.